Let's go. Go get him, man.
Nice to see you.
Hi, Morton. I'm Steve Schroyer.
Hello, Steve.
Nice to see you.
Why? I got his best-selling book, and I haven't even started. Is he trying to hustle this book? Hey, listen, gang, I love my job, but I got really one problem, all right? It's that, well, it makes me a member of the media, and I hate being associated with the left-wing, knee-jerking, pablum-puking press. Is the media biased? You bet your buns it is! Hey, let me introduce our guests on stage tonight, all right? To my left is Philip Nobley, who's the article editor for Penthouse. How are you, Philip?
Fine.
To Philip's left is Stephen Schroyer, who is the PBS media critic and also the brother of a good friend of mine, Congressman Schroyer. How are you?
Delighted.
Let me get a plug-in for his new book, all right? It's called A Complete Guide to Video Cassette Movies. Does this include dirty ones, too?
No, everything except pornography.
Everything except pornography. Hey, wait a second. I might be liking this guy. I might be liking this guy here for a second. Hey, guys, let me start with Philip. Is the media controlled by the pablum-puking liberals?
Would that it were, Mort. In fact, the press is a vast right-wing conglomerate.
No, jeez.
Everybody...
A vast right-wing conglomerate. You mean it's owned by right-wingers and run by left-wingers?
No. In cartoon terms, that's correct. The people who own...
In cartoon terms?
Yes.
I can't understand cartoon terms.
This show is a cartoon show, Mort.
Wait a second. If this show is a cartoon, and he's making fun of you, then he's goofy. Yeah! Explain to me your concept of the right wing. Wait a second, cool it. Explain to me your right-wing concept of the press.
Well, as everyone knows, the rich control most things in the United States.
The rich control the press in the United States.
Of course.
And you think all the rich are conservatives?
Oh, no, I think rich wealth tends to create conservative views. Who owns the press in the United States? Very wealthy people. This is
Tell me who owns the press in the United States.
Pardon?
Tell me who owns the press. Who owns Penthouse?
Bob Guccione.
Conservative?
No.
No, huh?
No.
Who owns Playboy?
Hugh Hefner.
Conservative?
No, absolutely not.
I see.
Who owns the New York Times? Who owns the Washington Post? Who owns the LA Times? Who owns Time Magazine?
Who's the editor? Who's the editor, all right, of the Washington Post? Ben Bradley, am I right?
Ben Bradley.
Conservative?
Absolutely not.
No, you're in this amazing. It's run by the conservatives. This guy hasn't named a damn conservative
No, I
yet.
said it's owned by conservatives. It's owned by conservatives, and those who own the presses control the presses. But, Maud, you're absolutely right. The people in the press, the working press, tends to be left of center. And I think that comes merely from education.
Or lack of it.
No,
not lack of it.
All right, go ahead. Go ahead. Let's hear what Stephen has to say.
My colleague is onto something interesting, but part of the problem is you can't define the press. There is no single generality. There's a difference between network television news and local television news. A significant difference. Local television news, for the most part, tends to be much less good. The people are much less qualified, and so on.
And local television news tends to be much more conservative, am I correct?
They are owned, almost without exception, the television stations throughout America are owned by enormously wealthy and powerful organizations, whether it's the Gannett newspaper chain or Newhouse or
the McClatchy chain.
I know about the McClatchy chain, but they're an exception to the rule. But for the most part, the overwhelming percentage of the newspapers in America have, in the last elections, have endorsed Republican candidates for president. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It's simply a statistical fact. But you can't lump the press together, Mort. There's a difference between the Nation magazine and the National Review, and there's a difference between the National Enquirer and Time or Newsweek and so on.
Not much. Not much. They both go for sensationalism. They both go for anything that sells papers, anything that sells magazines. Let me ask you a question. Let me ask Mr. Scheuer a question.
Sensationalism. Go ahead.
Let me ask Mr. Scheuer a question. Isn't it true that the liberal press defeated Judge Bork before he even opened his mouth?
No, I think
it isn't true. Isn't it true that the liberal press,
categorically
forced the it's categorically, positively true?
No,
my categorically are just as good as yours.
The liberal press and the conservative press express the point of view of the liberal intelligentsia. It just so happens in this case
there was any such thing as intelligent liberals.
In this case,
let him talk. Let him talk.
The liberal intelligentsia happened to have persuaded the nation. We were right on this issue. And we won. That is the liberal intelligentsia.
The country lost, and the liberal intelligentsia, which makes up approximately 5% of this nation, dictated to this nation what the hell would go on.
No, it didn't dictate. Told the nation what was going on.
It dictated. It got a judiciary. It got a judiciary committee so upset, so concerned with their own political well-being that they were able to go along with anything that the press said. You defeated Bork. You defeated Bork. Philip, you know it. I mean, Philip, you know it. They defeated Bork before he even opened his mouth.
Mort, there was a very extensive nationwide coalition of an enormous number of disparate groups. There were church groups, hundreds of church groups and other organizations that were opposed to Bork. There were civil rights groups, there were women's organizations, there were educational institutions. You can't characterize it as just a liberal group. There were groups of all persuasions, including an enormous number of constitutional scholars.
Touching each other on the stage.
And this same press, this same vast middle press in the United States is the one that made Ronald Reagan so popular. It's only when Ronald Reagan is exposed for his amiable duncehood that you complain about the press. When Mike Wallace Jr. When he wrote a book about Nancy Reagan, I didn't hear you complaining. In fact, when the press gores the right, it's controlled by the left. But when the press praises the right, then it's...
when did the press... Wait a second. I know it's time. We've run out of this segment. I don't give a damn. When did the press, all right, praise the right? Please tell me that.
Ronald Reagan got away with murder for 7 years because the press was asleep with Ronald Reagan.
Well, first thing is, let me tell you something, pal. I mean, some of the members of the press, I'm sure, would love to sleep with Ronald Reagan, but only Nancy does, all right? Let me tell you something. Ronald Reagan has not yet been in office for 7 years, so don't say he got away with murder for 7 years. He'll be in office January 20th for 7 years.
Are you going to quibble, Mort?
There's one very important...
So this is more of the great press's knowledge of current affairs.
You asked about one of the important press groups. There is at least an important issue to consider. All three of the commercial television networks, who have enormous power and influence, have in the last couple of years been acquired by outside companies. NBC, which had been owned by RCA, but essentially an independent
General Electric,
is now owned by General Electric. There is a widespread concern among members of the NBC News department that there are already certain kinds of subjects having to do with General Electric's posture in the defense industry and other kinds of subjects that are essentially off limits. General Electric started a political action campaign asking NBC News to contribute money to that. And only when it became such a momentous embarrassment did they withdraw it. And they said the contributions to the political action campaign
I'm going to take a break for a second now, all right? But I want you to think for just a second. I just want you to think for a second about your brother, all right? The brother, the congressman, and what kind of political action funds he gets monies from, all right?
Fine.
So you're not opposed to political action.
Yes, I am.
Who runs the media anyway, huh? Stay tuned. We'll find out. Everybody, welcome back. I want you to meet some new guests who are on stage with us tonight, and also our first guests, Philip Nobley and my friend Stephen Scheuer, are down at the Loudmouths now, appropriately named for members of that side of the press. Reed Irvine, Michael Massing from The Nation magazine. Reed Irvine is with Accuracy in Media. Reed, tell me, I think you can give me this answer by the name of your organization. What I'd like to know is, who are these people you accuse of being inaccurate, and what is their motivation? And I accuse them of being inaccurate also.
Well, Mark, going back to your first discussion, surveys have shown that 2/3 of the people that work in the media, the editors and the reporters, are liberal left. Now, these are surveys...
How do you identify them as liberal left?
Well, let me cite a survey that was done by...
How many of them voted for Jimmy Carter?
Well, there it was 81%. According to a survey done by Lichter and Rothman, and that is the minimum of the vote for the Democratic candidate for president in the election since 1964. In 64, it was as high as 94% for Johnson over Goldwater. So that gives you some idea of where they're coming from.
But virtually all of the papers they work for endorse the Republican candidate.
You know, once every 4 years, the publisher gets a chance to endorse a candidate. But the reporters and the editors who are deciding what is going into the paper, they're working every day. And they're putting their prejudices and their biases in the news every day, day in and day out. And the publishers, including Arthur Sulzberger, who is the publisher of the New York Times, who is not a conservative, as you know, Steve, nor is Kay Graham at the Washington Post. These people, they don't go down and say what goes into the paper, what's going to be on the front page. They're out of it.
Reed,
you know that.
Reed, I've read the Accuracy in Media materials. If the liberal press is biased, then so are you.
I agree.
This is a...
You're absolutely right. I am biased, and I'll tell you why I'm biased. I'm biased in favor of freedom, in favor of the free enterprise system we have in this country, in favor of defending it and protecting it, and I have never made any bones about that since I started Accuracy in Media 19 years ago.
Who really decides what we see on television news and read in the newspapers?
The people that decide are the producers, people whose names you don't even know, whose faces you never see. The producers, the writers, and then they put up a Dan Rather or a Peter Jennings, the pretty boys up in front, who will read the scripts that they're presented with, for the most part. And they do some very atrocious things. Let me give you an example.
Incidentally, my producers damn well don't select my topic.
Well, and you're different.
They're a bunch of liberal.
Anybody looking at you, Morton, knows that nobody tells you what to say. Let me give you an example. On May 30th of this year, CBS broadcast a Soviet disinformation propaganda that the United States Army had created the AIDS virus and was spreading it around the world. They said this with a straight face. Now, we protested this to CBS immediately. We got a letter back from the executive producer of the CBS Evening News who said he didn't see anything wrong with this, anything they had to correct. His name is, guess what? Anybody ever hear of him? Tom Batag. You never heard of the guy. But he's the guy that decided. Now, I'll have to tell you something. CBS to this day has not corrected it, even though the Soviet Union, TASS itself, the news service of the Soviet Union, has come out and said this is a lie. This is not true. Eminent Soviet scientists denounced it. And CBS wouldn't even report that. They leave this lie, defaming the United States, floating around the world. The last word out of CBS, And that's it.
Now, let me ask Mr. Massing to respond, all right? We're just leaving him sitting
Well,
there.
I do know Tom Battag. I happen to have met him on several occasions, and based on what Reed is saying, you get the impression this guy walks around with a cap with a red star on his head, and I think that's ridiculous. I know these people who work these shows. If you watch the networks and their presentation of the Soviet Union, I would like you to sit here and tell me that these people are pro-Soviet, that they believe stuff, that when the Soviets say the U.S. has planted AIDS around the world, we all know that's nonsense, and I just can't believe...
Then why the hell do we report it? Why
They're probably reporting it in a way to show how nonsensical the Soviet
Did you
Union
write an article in
is.
Did you write an article in the Nation denouncing what CBS had done and saying that they didn't apologize for it?
I never saw it. It's the first time I've heard of it.
Michael, you're not reading
Everyone
the
else
report,
saw it. I
obviously.
knew about it.
Let me tell you how wrong you are, Michael, because Lawrence Tisch, who is the president of CBS and the CEO, at the CBS annual shareholders meeting last May said, when I said this was Soviet disinformation, Lawrence Tisch said, that's your opinion. And I said, well, it happens to be also the opinion of the State Department and the Pentagon. He says, well, we don't have to believe everything the Pentagon says.
But we are expected to believe everything that the newspapers say.
Yeah.
Everything the newspapers say.
Well, let me
never inaccurate. Let me ask both of these guests while they're up here. Let me go to you first, Mr. Massing. Let me go to you first, Mr. Massing. Mr. Scheuer, just a second, please. All right. Is there an organized conspiracy by the liberals in this country and mass media?
I think there's as much of a conspiracy of the liberals in the mass media as there are in law, medicine, any other profession.
Then
This country doesn't run. This country does not run that way.
Professions are also conspiratorial as far as the left is concerned. I appreciate that.
I'd say if you think the doctors are run by conspiracy, then I'll grant it to you.
I ask you the same question.
Conspiracy in the sense that Peter Jennings, Tom Brokaw, and Dan Rather get together and decide what they're going to do? No, absolutely not. It doesn't have to be that way. Philip put his finger on this when he said it's education. What these people that are running the media, they are, for the most part, graduates of our liberal arts colleges. You look at the professors in these colleges, they are overwhelmingly liberal left. These kids go in, as I did when I went to college, they come out indoctrinated with those left-wing ideas, for the most part. And that's where it starts.
Go ahead, Philip. Go ahead, Philip. You look about the age to have fought in the Vietnam War, did you?
No.
You weren't in Canada, were you?
No, I was. I'm proud to say I was a draft dodger, though, and if I had to do it again, I would...
Did I hear that right? You were a draft dodger? You were a draft dodger? Let him talk. Let the man talk. I admire anyone who tells the truth, and I admired that small bit of truth coming from Philip. Go ahead.
I try to dodge all criminal wars, Mort. But I want to say that the left is also guilty, as Reed is, of the censorship of ideas. I remember being appalled that people on my side of the fence were opposed to showing America on television because they felt it would tick off the Russians in an area, a time when we're moving towards détente. I remember seeing letters to the editor of the Times day after day by good liberals saying this is bad television. I say let 1,000 flowers, political flowers, bloom in the media. And what happened?
You get
the left was disappointed. What happened? Now we are on the verge of détente with Russia and a major treaty, even after America. So the point is, our politics ought not to control our entertainment.
Mr. Massing.
I'd like to ask Reed a question based on something that he just said, which is CBS broadcasts this thing about AIDS in the Soviet Union, and our State Department denies it. Well, Reed, would you like our media merely to put on television what our State Department says, or our Pentagon, or the White House? Isn't that exactly what the Soviet Union does? Pravda goes up there giving the Communist Party line. We don't want our media to be that way.
Not only has the State Department denied it, the Soviet Union has also denied it after the fact. Now, here's what they didn't do. The State Department, 5 months before CBS aired that broadcast, said the Soviets are spreading disinformation around the world and have been doing so for a year, accusing us of creating the AIDS virus. CBS, NBC, and ABC didn't report that, Michael. That was a State Department
Never saw it. Never saw it.
When they came out with this Soviet report in March of last year, did they go to the State Department and ask for a comment? No. They didn't think of, you know.
The way our journalism operates is you get a variety of viewpoints.
Yeah.
You go to the State Department, you get their viewpoint. You go to Moscow, you get their viewpoint.
The way our media operates is they make the accusation on page 1 and the apology on page 17. Did the media massacre William Casey? Next. Stay tuned. All right, if you got a scorecard, you can follow the players, all right? We're going to give you the players again on home base up here on stage. Michael Massing is with us from The Nation, Reed Irvine from Accuracy in Media, and Bernadette Casey Smith, the daughter of William Casey, the former CIA director, now deceased. At our loudmouth, of course, Philip Nobley from that esteemed publication Penthouse. And, of course, I knew there'd be one of you out there, all right? And, of course, the syndicated columnist, Datsun Rader, with us at the other loudmouth. Good evening, Datsun. How are you? Let me start our round robin here with Mr. Massing. Mr. Massing, I understand that you have just read Bob Woodward's book, all right? Do you think William Casey was massacred, and explain?
I think that the book was... It's a 508-page book. I think it's good for 507 pages and very unfortunate on the last page, which is a famous scene in the hospital, which I think rings very... It's fishy. I think it probably happened, but I think it cast a pall on the rest of the book. I think that it has unfortunately made a very good book seem very questionable in many people's minds.
Incidentally, gang, for the second time, we invited the wily Mr. Woodward to join us tonight. Gutless wonder that he is, he refused to show. All right. Bernadette, what Mr. Massing has said, if I can paraphrase you, and the press always paraphrases me, so I'm sure you won't mind. What you have said is that book was a good and fair reporting of William Casey, except for the last 2 pages, which indeed maybe happened in your mind, but cast kind of a doubt on the rest of the book. So you're saying the first 505 pages were fair.
With the exception of the final scene, I think it was a good book. The exception of the final scene. Well, of course, if you were a critic and you were of course criticizing a play, if the last scene was bad and left you with a bad ending, you'd say it was a lousy play. Was it a good book or a bad book? I like to think that I can take a whole book together and not be just focused on one particular thing, which people in the press have.
Bernadette, Mr. Massing seems to feel that this is a very good job of reporting. You obviously disagree, I would hope. Why?
Well, I feel it's a novel. It's a novel masquerading as journalism. There's nothing to the book. There's no point of the book but for that last scene. That is the hook that makes everything else in the book understandable. There would be no book. He would have nothing to sell if he didn't have that last scene, and that never happened. He had no way of getting to the hospital, and unfortunately, and I wish it weren't true, but my father couldn't speak. So, I mean, you know.
What about the rest of the book did you really object to?
Well, what about the rest of the book? He says, what about the rest of the book?
You know, none less than William Sapphire, the conservative columnist in the New York Times, he basically agreed with me. He said he also objected to the last scene, but he said, this is an excellent book, and even Mr. Casey's admirers should accept it as probably the most accurate portrayal of a very committed man we're likely to get.
Let's find out if Mr. Sapphire's right. Here's his daughter. There could be no greater admirer. Bernadette?
I call it, believe me, journalism. He has all these facts. My father was the biggest critic about leaks in the government. To think my father would tell secrets on the American government that could jeopardize this country to a reporter, and any reporter who ever interviewed Dad would kind of definitely agree with me. He would not give information out.
But your father was also very shrewd. He knew how to use the press. He realized Bob Woodward is the best investigative reporter in the country, is writing a book about the CIA. I could see your father saying, I am going to engage him in a conversation because by doing so, I might be able to lead him in certain directions where he will see the world from my viewpoint.
Now, he assumes, he assumes that he can put words into your mouth, so why don't you put a few into his? You knew your dad.
He would. I mean, it's, of course,
Do you think he didn't talk to Woodward?
No, he talked, first of all, Woodward said he met with Dad 48 times. There are 8 documented meetings. He had dinner with my parents numerous times. He said he came to the house once for a brunch with about 12 other people. And then he said, you know, it's just ridiculous. Then all the other times were at big parties, 100 people. My father
he possibly did talk to him there, and that was the 48 times. He may have exaggerated.
Boy, can we stretch it when we want to get a story? Can the press stretch it?
Let me say, we've done a name report. The title of it is Bob Woodward Lies Again. Now, Bob Woodward has been getting away with lying ever since the Watergate days.
No, before that. He got away with it in Prince George's County.
Yeah,
no one ever brings that up.
That's right.
The guy that he belittled up there who ended up collecting in a lawsuit against him, and it was hushed up.
And what about Watergate? Was that a total lie?
Let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. I find it amazing that Bob Woodward's sources are always unidentified, known as Deep Throat.
Not true.
Who the hell knows? I mean, there's Linda.
Are you
Did he
defending
meet with Linda Lovelace? Or a man who is lying in a hospital bed with a tumor and can't talk. These are all the guys that he talked. These are his close sources. I say that Bob Woodward is a liar and a coward.
Mort.
Don't point at me. Bernadette. Now, Bernadette. I want to make. Read just a second. Yeah. Bernadette.
Don't you think it's unfair to accuse a man like that when he's not
to our
here?
national security?
I think definitely they are. I think telling, you know, the press is very important in America. I think it does, if it does an ethical job where it takes responsibility for what they say. But when they report things that can hurt our friends around the world, it could be disastrous.
Mr. Woodward's book is actually filled with descriptions of when your father engaged Ben Bradley and the editors of the Washington Post in long discussions about what should be published and what should be not. And it does seem to me that in the book, the Washington Post went out of its way to water stories down, to delay them until an agreement could be worked out between the authorities and the paper.
Oh, listen.
Agreeing that they would not believe.
Michael, listen.
Come on.
Miss Casey,
Bob Woodward.
Miss Casey, I think we're in danger of trivializing this issue. And Mort, if I may say
Not
so,
trivial to Miss Casey.
I think you have crossed that line already.
It's not trivial to Miss Casey. I didn't ask you. You can write any damn thing you want about me, pal, as you will, and it'll all come from here.
Miss Casey, could you tell us something in the book that endangered national security, or some piece of intelligence apart from that hospital scene, which you know, and I don't know what you do for a living, to be untrue? Where was Bob Woodward inaccurate in the body of the book? And what actions did your father supposedly commit in that book that make you ashamed?
I am never ashamed of my father. He was a great patriot. And I think it's outrageous for a reporter to put a lie in a book when the person is not here. At least Deep Throat might come out if he exists, but that's not the case.
The CIA.
The lie is that Dad, my father, knew all about the Iran-Contra affair, and I don't believe it's true, and I know Dad could not tell him that was true.
Miss Casey, do you believe that your father funded right-wing death squads in El Salvador, which Bob Woodward charges in your book? Are you proud of that kind of activity?
First of all, I know my father did not talk about secrets on our national security level to Bob Woodward, and he didn't talk to me about them.
So you don't know?
He could not talk to anyone without transparency on any national security
But he
matter.
selected Bob Woodward, who was a close friend of Linda Lovelace's, all right? He selected Bob Woodward to bare his soul to. He's selecting a left-wing guy like that when he believes this country is
Because
great
he was
and
smart.
he's giving them secrets. Smart hell. He was smart enough not to tell him a damn thing.
A lot of people...
We'll be back in just a second. Some people say that the media is a pack of reporters. I say it's a wolf pack.
Are you tired of sitting home watching this show?
All right. Okay. All right, everybody. Welcome back. Remaining on home base with us, Reed Irvine, Michael Massing. Again, let me reintroduce, please, Dotson Rader, who not only writes for Esquire magazine, but the New York Times, and I believe the Republic. Is that correct, Dotson? Let me address this to you, all right? I say the media creates stories. What do you say?
Well, I don't think the media creates stories. I think the media at times overemphasizes stories.
Okay. In other words, they take a small, minor event and they blow it up because it's exciting.
Let me give you an example. You take, in terms of presidential candidates, there's a certain amount of selectivity in what the media decides to cover, and I think that has, to a large degree, comes from the given opinion among all of us in the national press, because most of us know each other and we go to the same parties and so on, and there's a certain kind of majoritarian opinion that develops. In the presidential race now,
the question is, like sharks.
I mean, why do you get... I mean, there's a real question in my mind is why did we go after Gary Hart? I never would have run that story as a womanizer, and we don't go after Jesse Jackson, who is probably more of a womanizer.
All right, let me ask you a question. All right. Let me ask you a question. Let me give you an example of what I think is a media-created story. Imelda Marcos's 3,000 pair of shoes. Headlines. I mean, that's really a headline story, isn't it? Some babe from the Philippines decides she wants 3,000 pair of shoes.
Well, you gotta...
About Daniel Ortega's eyeglasses.
She is not some babe.
She was the wife...
30 or 40 million.
Get up to the loud mouth. Your mouth isn't that loud. We need you to microphone.
Well, to a degree, two things that interested me tonight is there seems to be on the part of Ms. Casey, for example, a certain amount of ignorance of what the methodology of journalism is in terms of sources and the double and triple checking of sources. The Times or the Post or any national media, there are very strict rules in terms of what can and cannot be run. You would be amazed at the amount of information that comes to members of the national press that we never touch. I mean, the question is, if...
How about the Fawn Hall strike?
Let me give you an example.
All right, but I don't want to run this. We've got a lot of things to talk about.
All right,
right?
listen, just in terms of how news judgments made. One of the it's almost a cliche in terms of journalism is, how do you determine if you're going to write about whether the First Lady, for example, I don't mean this First Lady, a First Lady is having an affair? When is it news? If she's having an affair with a Marine guard at the White House, that's not news. But if she's having an affair with the Soviet ambassador, that is news.
Okay. I think that's a very fine line and a very good line that you've drawn.
And one thing, in terms of the press, which I'm part of, that I find unsettling, is the hypocrisy that's developed in terms of holding people running for public office to standards we do not hold ourselves to, and that the American people do not hold themselves to.
I never thought I was going to agree with you. My God, you're right. But let me give you a couple of more stories. I still say the press creates stories, all right? How about the Janet Cook story?
Well, there again, that's the fault of Ben Bradley, and it's the fault of the checking at the Washington Post.
Janet Cook story, folks, is the lady who wrote the story about the 8-year-old heroin addict for which she won the Pulitzer Prize.
That's right. Let
me tell you who her editor was, who went through that story word for word for word through the entire story. Bob Woodward. The story was a total phony. She admitted it. She made it up.
No,
that's a
Bob
created
Woodward
story.
Proved it was a phony.
No, he did not.
He did like hell.
He did not.
After
No, he did not.
He was her editor.
Right,
He
after
was
it
the
was-
editor, and he did not disprove it. The
After
confession
it
was
was
made to
published.
Dave Moranis of the Washington Post, and Woodward had nothing to do with it.
After it was published.
More misinformation, Philip.
No, you were wrong.
Philip, more misinformation, all right?
It was Dave Moranis.
And not Bob Woodward.
Jim and Tammy Baker, a very, very meaty story. I'd expect to read that in the Star. I did. I'd expected to read it in the Inquirer. I did. All right. I didn't expect it would hold the attention of the front pages of the major press in this country for as long as it did. Some ugly guy who's making it with an ugly girl because he's a minister. Yeah. Whoopie-doo. Let's take a break for just a second. Does the media report news or does the media make it? We'll find out, all right? Geraldine Ferraro's press secretary next. Joining us in this segment at our loudmouth over here is Trudy Mason, the former press secretary for Geraldine Ferraro. Now, well, wait a second now. You know, I got to tell you, I think what we're getting into with the press, I think they have a wolf pack mentality. You know, the wolves all descend. They all descend, and they like to feed off the same body. Maybe we'll get some information from Trudy. You've been in the wolf pack. How does it start?
Well, I feel like I'm in the wolf pack right now, so...
Okay.
I've been sitting very patiently, waiting to say something, so I hope I'll be given the opportunity to. Besides being New York State press secretary for the Mondale-Ferraro campaign, and we can get into what the press did and didn't do to both Mondale and Ferraro and the Reagan-inspired press.
Why you're here.
Well, I know, but I'd also like to, I'm here as a person, so I'd also like to tell you what I did after that.
You're here as an expert on the Ferraro situation. You're here as an expert on the Ferraro situation. Let's hear that first. If we have time, we'll allow you to make a statement.
Well, last year I also did public relations for the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament, which crossed the United... hey,
Whoa.
I listened to all of you shouting. Listen to me for 1 second. Thanks, okay? And let me tell you, this myth about the, quote, liberal establishment press, I couldn't get a story about the Great Peace March in the New York Times or in the Washington Post.
It was boring.
No, it wasn't boring. What do you know about it?
Even the problem-puking liberals knew that was boring. Let's hold hands for nuclear peace.
Confusing the facts. Hands Across America was something that had to do with hunger. You've got some very hungry people out here right now. But let's not confuse hands and feet.
Okay, fine.
Okay?
Tell us about whether you think the press treated Ferraro properly.
So let's talk about different parts of the anatomy, if you want to talk about different parts of the anatomy.
Let's talk about the press. Did they treat Ferraro fairly? Do you think they treated her fairly?
Do I think they treated her fairly? No. Do I think they treated Ronald Reagan fairly? They bent over backwards. You keep on pointing to your backside. Well, they were on their backsides as far as Ronald Reagan. They bent over backwards. All they did was report that he smiled, that balloons went up. They treated Jerry Ferraro terribly unfairly.
How?
When the same thing about income taxes came out about George Bush, it was played over in one day, and he was patted on the head. Jerry Ferraro, it began...
Let me hear what Dotson has to say.
The reason for that, I mean, the press turned on... as a sport, I've known Jimmy Carter since he was governor of Georgia. Jimmy Carter's a mean man. I mean, he's a very difficult man to like. Ronald Reagan, when he first got in, the first time I met him, I met the First Lady, he is... I can't stand what he stands for, but he is so amenable, he is so kind, he's so friendly and thoughtful that you sit down to write a story about him and you pull your punches because you don't want to hurt the old guy. I mean, that's literally true. And you do a story he likes, he calls you on the phone, which Carter never did, Nixon never did. This White House does a lot of stroking of the press. We all have egos, and whether we're liberals or conservatives, we all get a little dizzy when we're invited to a state dinner as a reward. And that's what it's about. I mean, he played the press's ego better than any president since Roosevelt.
Also, a number of times I've talked to my friends in the press, and yes, I have friends in the press also, and I have said, and I...
Didn't do you much good when you were working for Ferraro, did it?
No, let me tell you something. Because the press gets onto a story. Yeah, they will play very nicely for a president who smiles and who kind of salutes smartly when he gets off the helicopter.
You making fun of that? You making fun of that?
I'm not making fun of anything. I am stating a fact.
Salute smartly.
Well, what would you call it? Isn't that?
I would call it respect for the people who are guarding his life, for the military of this country. Respect that very few presidents have had. Respect that your candidate didn't have.
Okay, now let me just tell you that what the press has said, very simply, and what you're doing right now, too, you're trying to boost up your ratings by sensationalism.
Honey, I can't boost my ratings with someone as boring as you. You're boring. You're not telling me anything. If I was going to boost my ratings, I'd get the real person here. Your old boss. You're nothing. You're a zero. Forget it. Go ahead, Mr. Scheuer. Go ahead, Mr. Scheuer.
One of the most. You know me well enough to call me honey, okay?
What should I call you, bitch? You're one of these women livers who can't be a honey or a sweetie or a baby. Huh? You got it, pal. I'm a sexist. I'm all in favor of sex. Go ahead, Mr. Scheuer.
Really a good advertisement for
There's an extraordinarily important...
Shameful how you're treating
an extraordinarily important point.
If you think it's so shameful, why don't you get the hell off here then? Take her out for a drink.
Get me off that
Take her out for a drink.
You can't get me off that easy.
Take her out for a drink.
But
go ahead, Mr. Scheuer.
There's an extraordinarily important point that you made that has not been dealt with. You said in a very pejorative, nasty way that the press creates news. That's part of the press's obligation to dig out...
Not to create it.
Yes.
Not to create it, no. To find it, yes. To create it, no.
Oh, what's the difference?
To report...
There's a big difference.
Simplistic.
You don't know the difference between creative and find.
Most
I can
news
go
is
to
out
kindergarten.
there,
You with your great education don't know what the hell you're talking about. You're right for these fancy newspapers. You don't want to crap. I'll be back and just, how does the press see me? I'll tell you. We've got very little time left. I want to go to this nice lady, Trudy Mason. Sweetheart, it's your turn.
Thank you, darling. Yes.
You're welcome, Angel.
Okay. I think that, very seriously, that you brought up something unintentionally, which is the whole issue of sexism and the way Jerry Ferraro was treated, because the issues are totally lost. Whether it's 500 people marching across the United States to end the madness of nuclear armament, or whether it's the issues that Fritz Mondale brought up and Jerry Ferraro brought up during the campaign, which are all coming home to roost right now, whether it was aid to the Contras or whether it was the budget. When Fritz Mondale talked about the fact that we were facing the greatest deficits ever, everyone poo-pooed him.
Okay.
And Ronald Reagan...
There's only so much time.
I just want to say,
there's
but
only
all
so
the
much
press
time.
focused
Philip,
on...
please step in
all
there.
the press
Philip, you're losing your time. You're losing your time,
Jerry
Philip.
Ferraro's
That's one of the reasons Geraldine lost. Her mouth would never zip. Go ahead. Philip, go ahead. Go ahead.
The kamikaze press, both left and right, makes a big mistake by this moral crusade. People on the left as well as the right suffer from it. And I just want to mention that one of Reed Irvine's good friends and a high official at the Justice Department resigned his job last year because he was going to be exposed as a man who kept a private porno collection. I think that man should not have lost his job merely because he read Penthouse.
Who was that?
Al Regnery.
All right, we'll have another show on that. We'll have another show on that. I want to thank... I get the last word here, Mr. Scheuer. We're not in Congress right now, all right? Let me tell you something, my friends, each and every one of you out there. Do I like the press? No. I think they suck, all right? I'm just telling you. And I'm part of the media. Is the press going to get me at some point? Yeah. Well, are they going to get me because I've been married 3 times? Because I cheated on my second wife? Because when I was a kid I went to jail for 60 days? Because I passed a bum check? Because I was late on my taxes? You got it all now, press. Write whatever the hell you want. The wolf pack is back.